Eli Morgan was a man born for solitude. He'd grown up in the far reaches of Alaska, where neighbors were miles apart, and survival meant self-reliance. By the time he was 30, Eli could read animal tracks like lines in a book, knew the calls of owls and the silence of wolves, and could spend months alone in the wilderness without flinching. But nothing in his years of trapping, fishing, or hunting prepared him for the winter of 1987, the year he found the cabin. It was marked on no map. He'd stumbled across it after following a frozen stream deeper into the spruce forest than he'd intended. The structure was old but solid, built from heavy logs blackened with age, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The single door had no lock, only a wooden bar across the inside, as though it had been meant to keep something out. Inside, the place was eerily tidy. A rough-hewn bed, a small iron stove, and a table with a single chair. No tools, no supplies, no sign of anyone living there for decades. It should have felt abandoned. But the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, as if someone had only just left. Eli told himself it was luck. Shelter this deep in the bush was rare and the cold could kill. He made a fire, set his traps outside, and settled in. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The fire crackled, snow fell soundlessly outside, and the forest seemed as still as a graveyard. He almost felt grateful for the cabin. But on the 3rd night, the knocking began. It was close to midnight. Eli lay awake, half drifting, when 3 sharp raps echoed from the north wall. Knock, knock, knock. He sat up, heart racing, and listened. The forest was silent. No wind, no shifting trees, no sound but the pop of the stove. He told himself it must have been snow sliding off the roof, and after a while, lay back down. Then it came again. This time from the opposite wall. Knock, knock, knock. Eli grabbed his rifle, yanked open the door, and stepped into the freezing night. His lantern lit the snow in a pale circle. The ground stretched untouched, smooth as glass. No footprints, no animals, nothing. The silence pressed in, heavy and unnatural. Shaking his head, he went back inside, barred the door, and stoked the fire. But as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the knocking returned, faint, deliberate, patient. By the 4th night, Eli's nerves were frayed. He'd searched the cabin inside and out, found no loose beams, no hollow walls. The snow outside remained pristine every morning, undisturbed. That night, the knocks came faster. From the roof, the walls, the door, always in groups of 3. Knock, knock, knock. Eli shouted into the dark. Who's out there? His voice echoed through the trees, but nothing answered. Then, just as he lowered his lantern, the knocking came from directly behind him, from inside the cabin wall. On the 5th night, the whispers began. Eli had barely slept, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling from too much coffee and too little rest. The firewood pile was dwindling, but he didn't dare step too far from the cabin. The knocks came as always, steady and relentless. But this time beneath them he heard voices, at first faint, like the rustle of wind through branches, then clearer. Eli! He froze, blood running cold. Eli opened the door. He lunged for the stove, threw more wood onto the fire, and pressed his palms to his ears. But the whispers slid through the walls like smoke, soft and many, as though dozens of unseen mouths were murmuring his name. When he finally dared look up, frost had formed on the inside walls, and carved into the condensation with a finger was one word. By the 7th night, the storm came. Snow hammered the roof, piling high against the walls, bearing the cabin to its windows. Eli sat at the table with his rifle across his lap, lantern burning low, sweat freezing on his skin despite the fire. The knocking never stopped now. It circled him, roof, walls, floor, always in rhythm, always in threes. Knock, knock, knock. He screamed, "What do you want?" For the first time, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. Then from beneath the floorboards, a single voice rose above the storm. "Let us in." The stove flickered out. The lantern dimmed. The knocking started again, harder now, as if dozens of fists were pounding from all directions at once. Panicked, Eli unbarred the door and flung it open. Snow roared in, blinding him, and in the white blur of the blizzard he saw them. Figures. Tall, pale, stretched thin as trees, their limbs impossibly long, their heads tilted at inhuman angles. They stood just beyond the tree line, unmoving, their eyeless faces turned toward him. And then they all raised their hands. In unison they knocked. Knock, knock, knock. When rescuers found the cabin weeks later, it was half buried in ice. The stove was cold, the lantern was burned out. The door was barred shut from the inside. But Eli Morgan was gone. The snow outside was untouched. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Only one thing remained, carved deep into the wood above his bed. "We knocked," he answered. The Koyukuk River is a place that swallows sound. In the dead of Alaskan winter, when the sun barely skims the horizon and the forest locks itself in silence, the river freezes into an endless plain of ice and snow. For most locals, it is not a place to cross but to avoid, a boundary whispered about in stories, a path that belonged to something else. But in 1993, 4 hikers thought they were smarter than the warnings. They were young, experienced, and confident. 3 men and 1 woman, all eager to prove they could survive Alaska's deep wilderness. Their route should have taken them around the river's edge, through tangled forest and sharp ridges. But when they saw how wide and flat the Koyukuk stretched, glistening like a silver road under the pale sun, they decided to cut across. "It'll save us days," Derek, the oldest of the group, insisted. And so they stepped onto the frozen river, boots crunching against a silence so deep it seemed alive. At first, the crossing felt uneventful. Their breath fogged in the air, their packs shifted with each step, and the horizon seemed endless. The only sound was the crack of ice beneath their weight. By midday, they stumbled upon the first set of tracks. A line of human footprints stretched out across the frozen surface, frozen perfectly in the ice. The prints were sharp, every toe and heel pressed clearly, as if the person had walked there only hours earlier. But the trail ended abruptly. One moment, there were deep, solid footprints. The next, nothing. Smooth, untouched snow and ice. It was as if the person had simply vanished. No signs of a struggle, no return prints, no blood. Just a clean, sudden end. The hikers fell quiet. They told themselves it was strange, but not impossible. Maybe snow had blown over the rest. Maybe the river had shifted. But Derek couldn't shake the feeling. The prints were too crisp, too detailed to be old. And they weren't covered by snow. They just stopped. That night, they camped on the riverbank. The fire cast a weak circle of light against the darkness, and the wind hissed like a whisper through the trees. Derek couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he swore he heard footsteps crunching on the ice outside the tent. Slow, heavy, deliberate. He jolted awake, gripped his rifle, and crawled outside. The river lay still and empty, the ice shining under the moon. Their own footprints stretched behind them like a frozen scar. And then he noticed something strange. The prints at the far end of their trail didn't look like theirs. They were larger, wider, the stride too long for a human. And they seemed to be following. On the 3rd day, it happened again. Another trail of footprints, this one fresh. The edges were sharp, the ice newly broken, each step deep and clear. They followed the prints cautiously, nerves fraying. Step after step, until the trail stretched out into the middle of the river. And then nothing. The last footprint sank halfway into the ice, as if the person had suddenly become weightless, and beyond it the ice was smooth. No drag marks, no return trail, no body. Just silence. One of the hikers whispered, "It's like they were carried away." Derek crouched, his eyes narrowing. Beside the last footprint was something faint, something the others hadn't noticed. An impression in the ice, not a footprint. A hand. The fingers were long, spindly, too thin and stretched wider than any human hand should be. Derek didn't tell the others. That night the whispers came. At first, faint, blending with the wind, but soon they grew distinct. Voices, dozens of them, murmuring words none of them understood. The hikers huddled by the fire, faces pale. Then came the sound. 3 sharp raps against the ice. Knock, knock, knock. They froze, staring at the ground beneath them. Another 3 knocks, louder, closer. The river groaned and cracked as though something vast moved beneath the ice, circling them. "Just the ice shifting," one of them said, though his voice shook. But Derek knew better. The knocks had been deliberate, rhythmic, a signal. Something beneath the surface was listening. By the 5th day, the horror escalated. They were halfway across when Derek noticed the trail behind them, their own footprints. They were fading. At first, just a few, the sharp edges softening, smoothing. Then, as they watched in disbelief, entire stretches of their path vanished, as though the river were swallowing their steps. One of the hikers broke into a run. Another shouted at him to stop. But Derek knew it didn't matter. The river didn't want them to leave. What happened after is still debated. Weeks later, rescuers found only Derek. He stumbled barefoot into a hunting camp, frostbitten, his clothes in tatters, mumbling incoherently. His eyes were sunken, his lips cracked, his skin nearly blue. When they asked what had happened to his friends, he only said the same thing over and over. "They were walking with us, right beside us, we just couldn't see them. And when the river wanted us, it took." The search team scoured the Koyukuk. They found the trail of footprints from the group. It led straight into the center of the river. And then, just like all the others, it stopped. No bodies, no signs of struggle, only silence. Locals say the river doesn't just freeze, it remembers. And if you walk its surface in winter, the ice keeps count of your steps. Until one day your trail ends, and no one will ever find where you went. Blackstone Bay was known for its beauty, but also for its silence. In summer, cruise ships drifted through its icy waters, tourists snapping photos of glaciers that cracked and tumbled into the sea. The sun hung long in the sky, and the air smelled of salt and spruce. But in winter, the bay became something else entirely. The water turned black as ink, reflecting no starlight. The mountains surrounding it loomed like jagged shadows, their peaks lost in mist. The locals said you could hear voices on the water at night, carried by the tide, the drowned calling out to the living. Few people went near Blackstone Bay in January, but 3 fishermen thought they were tougher than legends. Alan was the oldest, mid-40s, with a weathered face and hands calloused from decades of hauling nets. Reggie was his younger cousin, a wiry man with a quick temper. Tom, the youngest, was barely 21, eager to prove himself, his laughter always a little too loud. They had heard the stories, everyone had, about the lights that appeared above the bay at night, luring boats farther and farther out until they disappeared for good. But Alan had debts, Reggie had pride, and Tom had youth. So on a frigid January evening, when the sun dipped early behind the peaks, they pushed their small skiff out into the water. The motor hummed softly, echoing across the dark surface. The lantern on deck swung with each wave, casting a jittering circle of light. their breath fogged in the air, white against the black backdrop of sea and sky. For hours, it was uneventful. The nets went in and out. The fish came up sluggish, frozen stiff. The men laughed, smoked, and cursed the cold. It was almost enough to make them forget the stories, until the first light appeared. At first they thought it was a reflection. A pale blue glow hovered just above the water, maybe 50 feet from the boat. It was round, the size of a lantern flame, pulsing faintly as though alive. Reggie frowned. Another boat? Alan squinted. Not on this bay, not this late. The orb floated closer, drifting smoothly across the surface. Then another appeared, and another. Soon the water was dotted with dozens of glowing spheres, dancing silently like will-o'-the-wisps. The men stared, their laughter gone. Then the motor sputtered and died. The silence that followed was crushing. The bay lay perfectly still, the only sound the water slapping softly against the hull. The lantern flame flickered, casting long shadows over their faces. Alan tried the ignition. Nothing. Reggie cursed under his breath. Tom leaned over the side, his eyes wide. They're beautiful. The nearest orb hovered just inches from the boat. Up close, the glow revealed something horrifying. Inside the light, faces shifted. Human faces, twisted and stretched, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Tom gasped. "Did you see that?" Before he could finish, the orb shot upward into the sky and vanished. The others followed, streaking upward one by one until the bay was plunged into blackness again. The motor roared back to life. The three men sat frozen, too terrified to speak. They should have turned back. But they didn't. Greed is louder than fear. Hours later, the lights returned. But this time, they didn't hover above the water. They rose from beneath it. Dozens of glowing spheres bubbled up through the black surface, lighting the bay from below. The boat rocked as if the water itself were alive, shimmering with otherworldly glow. The men leaned over the side, watching in horror as shapes pressed against the undersides of the orbs. Hands, faces, bodies. They weren't just lights. They were prisons. Each orb contained something trapped, something human. The voices came next. At first, faint whispers. Then louder, layering over one another. Sobs, screams, whispers in languages the men didn't recognize. The sound came from everywhere at once, filling their skulls, vibrating in their bones. Alan dropped his net. "We need to go, now!" But the motor wouldn't start. Reggie tried paddling, but the oars grew heavy, almost glued to the water. Tom clutched his head, rocking back and forth, mumbling nonsense. The lights circled tighter. Their voices rose higher like a choir of the damned. Then one orb rose directly above the boat. It pulsed once, twice, then burst. A wave of icy water crashed onto the deck. The fishermen screamed as hundreds of dead fish spilled across the boards, their scales glowing faintly. Their mouths were open, their eyes glassy. Every single one of them had no gills. The bay went silent. The men stood shaking, their boots crunching on the pile of lifeless fish. Then the orbs rose higher, circling above them like stars rearranging themselves. The light reflected off the mountains, painting the entire bay in eerie blue. The voices turned to laughter, cold, mocking. And then the orbs began to sink again, slipping beneath the surface one by one. Alan, Reggie, and Tom stood frozen, too terrified to move. When the last orb disappeared, the motor roared back to life. Only 2 men made it back. At dawn, Alan and Reggie staggered into town, frostbitten and hollow-eyed. They were found sitting on the dock, staring blankly at the water. When asked what happened to Tom, they didn't answer. The only words Alan ever spoke about that night were these: "The lights, they wanted him. They'll want more, they always do." To this day, No one fishes Blackstone Bay after dark, and when the sky is clear, locals say you can still see the orbs drifting silently over the water, waiting for the next boat foolish enough to follow. Denali is the tallest mountain in North America, but to many who live in its shadow, it is more than just a peak. It is a living presence, a spirit, a god. The Athabascans had always treated it with reverence, never trying to conquer it, only to survive near it. But climbers came anyway, chasing glory. They learned quickly that Denali doesn't forgive mistakes. Its avalanches bury camps whole. Its storms strike like war drums. Its silence gnaws at the mind. And some deaths, some disappearances, were never blamed on snow or cold. Those were the ones that began with a sound, a howl. In the spring of 2001, 5 climbers began their ascent. Alan, the oldest at 49, a dentist from Oregon who was chasing one last adventure before middle age chained him down for good. Connor, a school teacher from Colorado, lean and determined, more stubborn than skilled. Mark, a Canadian who'd climbed Everest and Kilimanjaro, quieter than the rest, carrying a notebook he filled with sketches of ridges and shadows. Jason, only 22, reckless and full of bravado, a kid who laughed too loudly and thought fear was a weakness. And their guide, Victor Hale, a man who knew Denali better than most. He'd submitted it twice, lost friends on its slopes, and carried the weight of a man who respected something far bigger than himself. The climb began like countless others, crampons biting into the ice, packs heavy with gear, wind whispering through frozen trees. But on the 6th night, everything changed. They camped at 14,000 feet. The stars overhead were diamond sharp, the tents glowing faintly against the snow like fragile lanterns. The silence was vast, a silence that pressed into their ears until even their own heartbeat sounded too loud. Then, close to midnight, a sound shattered it, a howl. It started low like a groan, then rose higher and higher until it became a shriek that rattled the tent poles. It echoed across the ridges carried by the ice, bouncing again and again until it felt as though the mountain itself was screaming. The climbers froze. Jason laughed nervously. Wolves. Victor's face was pale. No wolves this high. The howling came again, louder. This time it circled. It shifted from slope to slope, ridge to ridge, moving faster than anything could in snow that deep. Each time it rose, it came from a new direction. Alan gripped his sleeping bag, muttering prayers. Mark sat rigid, eyes darting. Connor whispered, "The wind's carrying it. Has to be." But Victor knew better. He stepped outside with his rifle. The air cut his lungs, the snow gleaming under a cold moon. At first there was nothing. Silence, the sky too bright, the shadows too deep. Then he saw the prints. Huge clawed impressions in the snow. Each step sunk deep, heavier than a man's weight. They led up from the tree line and ended halfway across the slope. Like whatever made them had simply leapt into the air. Victor said nothing when he returned to camp. The next day, tension brewed. Alan wanted to keep climbing. Connor argued it was just mountain madness. Jason mocked them all for being afraid of sounds in the dark. Only Mark stayed quiet, scribbling something in his notebook. That night the howls returned, but this time it wasn't one voice. It was many. Dozens of howls rose together, layered and overlapping until they formed a chorus of shrieking that shook the snow beneath their feet. The sound was unbearable, high and low at once, like metal tearing and bones grinding. The men covered their ears, some sobbing. Jason swore he heard words in the noise, buried whispers threading through the howls. When it finally ended, none of them slept. On the 9th night, Victor saw movement. At first, he thought it was a trick of moonlight, but as he stared, he saw a figure moving along the ridge. Not human. It ran on all fours with terrifying speed. Then it stopped, rose to stand upright. Its limbs were too long, its body gaunt. Its head tilted back, and the howl that followed split the night. Victor never told the others what he saw, but he noticed Mark sketching the same figure the next morning, his hand shaking. By the 12th day, the group was broken. Jason had stopped eating. He muttered to himself, his eyes glazed. Alan barely spoke, his lips blue, his prayers constant. Connor lashed out at everyone, accusing Victor of leading them into danger. And every night the howls drew closer. Sometimes they shook the tents. Sometimes they whispered just outside the canvas, the sound like breath sliding against their ears. Once, claw marks appeared across the snow only feet from camp, though no one had left their tents. Victor began to fear the mountain wasn't just testing them, it was hunting them. On the 14th night, the storm came. Snow roared down in waves, the wind shrieking like the howls themselves. The tents shook violently, half buried, their poles bending. The men huddled inside, praying. And then came the sound. The howls. But not distant this time. Inside the storm, inside the camp, shadows loomed against the tents, massive, hunched, moving in circles. Claws scraped slowly down the canvas, deliberate, taunting. Victor froze as a hand pressed against his tent wall, fingers impossibly long stretching the fabric inward. He could see the outline of joints bending the wrong way. Then Jason broke. He screamed, bolted from his tent, and ran into the white. His flashlight beam swung wildly, then vanished. The others heard his cries fade, swallowed by the storm. Then silence. Then a howl, long, triumphant, echoing across the slopes. By morning, the storm had cleared. Jason was gone. So were Alan and Connor, their tents shredded, claw marks gouged into the snow around them. Only Victor and Mark staggered down the mountain days later, frostbitten, hollow-eyed, barely alive. When rescuers asked what happened, Victor said nothing. He never climbed again. Mark whispered fragments in his sleep for weeks afterward. The only clear words anyone caught were, "They weren't wolves, they weren't men. They were something in between, guardians, and they didn't want us there." Even now, climbers still whisper about Denali. They don't just fear avalanches. They don't just fear frostbite. They fear the midnight howls that circle their tents, the shadows that scrape at the canvas, the guardians of the mountain who remind every intruder the same truth. Denali doesn't want you, and if you ignore the warnings, the howls will rise until you never leave. Dean Rowley had been a bush pilot for 20 years. He'd seen nearly everything Alaska could throw at a man: blizzards, sudden engine failures, emergency landings on rivers barely wide enough to hold a float plane. He wasn't the type to scare easily. But that winter of 1998, when he was asked to fly north to check on a tiny mining settlement deep in the interior, something about the request unsettled him. The town wasn't much more than a scattering of cabins and a store. 30, maybe 40 people lived there. Miners, their wives, their kids, a school teacher, and a doctor who'd come up from Anchorage years ago and never left. They had radios. They had supply drops. But for 3 weeks they'd gone silent. No orders, no messages, no replies. And in Alaska, silence was rarely a good sign. From the air, the town looked normal. Snow blanketed the cabins. The roofs sagged under white weight. A faint haze of smoke curled from the chimneys, rising steady into the sky. Dean circled twice, his gut tightening. The houses looked lived in. Fires were burning, but there was no movement. The streets were too clean. He banked the plane and brought it down onto the frozen strip, the skis hissing against ice. The engine coughed, then settled. That was when he noticed. No tracks. No footprints between houses. No sled marks. No paw prints from dogs. The snow was flawless, unbroken, as if no one had stepped outside for weeks. Dean cut the engine and climbed out. The air hit him sharp and metallic, the kind of cold that burned the lungs. His boots crunched loudly against the silence. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing. No answer. He walked to the nearest cabin, heart hammering. The door swung open with a groan. Inside, the stove was warm. A pot of stew sat on the counter, half-eaten, its surface congealed but not spoiled. A pair of boots sat neatly by the door. A coat was hung on a peg. A deck of cards was spread across the table as if someone had just been mid-game. But the cabin was empty. Dean moved to the next house. Again, the stove still burned faintly. Dishes were stacked in the sink. A book lay open on the bed. The doctor's cabin had medical charts strewn across the desk, as if interrupted mid-task. The schoolhouse had the day's lesson half written on the chalkboard. It was as if, at some precise moment, every single person had stood up and walked away. But walked where? There were no footprints. By dusk, Dean was rattled. He lit a lantern and tried the general store. The shelves were full. Food, tools, canned goods, untouched. The register sat open, a handful of bills still inside. But behind the counter, something strange caught his eye. Dozens of wind-up alarm clocks, all lined neatly in a row. And every one of them had stopped at the exact same time. 2:17 a.m. Dean's hands shook as he lit his lantern higher. He left the store and trudged back toward the strip. The settlement seemed to press in around him now. The cabins glowing faintly from their stoves, the windows reflecting his lantern light like empty eyes. He quickened his pace. When he reached the plain, his blood ran cold. The snow around it, which had been smooth when he landed, was now covered in footprints. Dozens of them, barefoot. They circled the plain again and again, pressed deep into the snow, toes splayed, some small, some large. But there was no one in sight. Dean climbed into the cockpit and slammed the door. He sat with his rifle across his lap, lantern flickering, listening. Hours passed, and then he heard it. Whispers, faint at first, carried on the still air, then clearer, curling around the fuselage, sliding under the doors. Dozens of voices, men, women, children. None of them sounded panicked. They sounded calm, patient, as though they were waiting for him. At some point he dozed, the lantern hissing. When he startled awake, dawn was breaking. He wiped the frost from the window and froze. The footprints were gone. The snow around the plain was smooth again, untouched. He fired the engine without checking the strip and lifted off as fast as the plane could climb. He didn't look back. Days later, when he reported what he saw, officials dismissed it. Supplies were sent. A search team flew in. They found the town exactly as he had described it. Fires out, food rotting, beds unmade, no people. But one thing had changed. In the schoolhouse, the chalkboard was erased, and in faint, uneven handwriting, a new word was scrawled across the board. The villagers were never found. Not their bodies, not their belongings, not even their sled dogs. The town was abandoned, struck from maps, left to vanish into snow and silence. But bush pilots still whisper about it. About the settlement where clocks froze at 2:17, where the footprints appeared only after dark, where voices whispered in the snow. The town that slept forever. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your night with us. If these stories gave you chills, there's plenty more waiting. Don't forget to subscribe to Night Fear Stories for new terrifying tales every single night. Sleep well, if you can.